Chair recognizes Mr. Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. The events of October 7th are tragic. Having spent some time in Israel, twice in the past few months prior to October 7th, having been to Surat, having previously been to having lunch with some of the kibbutzes that were attacked, many of those individuals that I met, many of the young people were the most pro finding a two-state solution. And what's tragic about October 7th is that may be an impossible dream for the foreseeable future. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel's right to defend itself. We stand that Israel is a Jewish homeland. But reading an article in the New York Times this morning where they were quoting Hamas's leadership on what their intent was. And their intent and their fear was that the Palestinian cause was slipping away. It wasn't central to dialogue. They were watching our facilitated negotiations with Saudi Arabia and Israel. They were watching the Abraham Accords. And their goal was to, there's not a tactical strategic benefit to beheading a baby or killing a child in front of their parents or killing parents in front of a child. That's to provoke terror. That's to provoke a reaction. And just quoting Hamas's leadership, they wanted this reaction. They wanted and anticipated that Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the Israeli government, the IDF, would have to respond to this terror and a heinous attack. And Hamas, from my calculation, understood that there would be a major civilian toll, and they would want to use the loss of innocent Palestinian civilian life to start to bring the Arab world back into a focus on the Palestinian cause. That they will continue to do this because it is their strategy to continue to provoke terror, to try to foment unrest in the streets. And I do worry that Prime Minister Netanyahu's response is exactly what what Hamas wants them to do, which is now also isolating Israel, and the world is creating anti-Semitic attacks on our college campuses around the world. And again, this is not talking about a ceasefire. This is a war between Israel and Hamas. We support Israel's right and actually will work with them to decapitate Hamas, erode Hamas's ability to ever perpetrate an attack like this again. But it is, and maybe this is a question for Secretary Stroul, there are other legitimate ways to prosecute this war against Hamas and perhaps minimize innocent Palestinian casualties. And I would imagine that we're in conversation with the IDF, with the Israeli government, to think about what those are, special operators, et cetera, while protecting the Israeli homeland.
Absolutely, we are. Consistently, Israel is a democracy with whom we share values. They have an obligation both to take action to defend their people and their country and ensure that Hamas can never again perpetrate a terrorist act like it did on October 7th. And they also have an obligation to distinguish between terrorists and militants and civilians who deserve access to humanitarian aid and protections consistent with the law, with international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict. The Israelis are absolutely aware and cognizant of it, and we have conversations with them every day.
And perhaps for Secretary Leaf, none other than Naftali Bennett and others in open sources have suggested a different strategy, and a strategy that says Israel is going to occupy Gaza. I think our own Secretary of State has said an occupation of Gaza is not possible, and I think would be a bad strategy. Is that?
Yeah, Congressman, in fact, I'd love to quote a few things that Secretary Blinken said today in Tokyo at the G7 ministerial, because it gets to a number of points that you've made. He said the only way to ensure that this crisis never happens again is to begin setting the conditions for durable peace and security, and to frame our diplomatic efforts now with that in mind. The United States believes key elements should include no forcible displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, not now, not after the war. No use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism or other violent attacks. No reoccupation of Gaza after the conflict ends. No attempt to blockade or besiege Gaza. No reduction in the territory of Gaza. And I would add to that a few affirmative principles that I know the Secretary feels very strongly about and that inform our approach now, and they will certainly inform our approach after, which is that, as I said earlier, Palestinian people have to be at the center of post-conflict governance. The West Bank and Gaza must ultimately be treated as a common polity, if you will. We have to look to rebuild a road that's long been missing towards negotiations for the Palestinians, because what we've seen, and you touched on it in your opening remarks, is a real weaponization of an unresolved issue, an unresolved legitimate aspiration for statehood. It's been weaponized by Hamas, and Hamas has an ultimately dark and nihilistic sort of a savage kind of vision for that cause, and it is not one that, frankly, most Palestinians align with. But Hamas and other members of Iran's so-called axis of resistance are very much desirous of weaponizing that issue, and so we must take it away from them, frankly.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Assistant Secretaries, your service of State and Defense has never been more important. It's really bipartisan. We want you to be successful. We want the President to be successful. It's critical for American families that you be successful. I'm very grateful with the leadership of Chairman Mike McCall, the Ranking Member Greg Meeks. It is bipartisan that we want you to succeed. But it's so critical because, indeed, I believe the Washington Post is correct last week when they cited that American families are at greater risk today of another 9/11 mass murder than ever. And so we've just got to be together and get these issues addressed. And to me, it's perfectly sadly clear that we're in a war we did not choose, of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. And it's an axis of evil. It began with the war criminal Putin when he conducted mass murder on February 24, 2022, invading Ukraine. It then, on October 7th, we know the massacre by the Iranian puppets who came in to massacre the people of Israel. Just so clear, so sad. And we also know the Chinese Communist Party has indicated that Taiwan, 24 million people, do not exist. We've just got to be working together, and I am just so concerned that all of this leads to death to Israel, death to America. Being American families. And then, indeed, Madam Secretary, when you mentioned about Hamas and their perverted view of the world, indeed, American families and also civilization should know that the Hamas Covenant of August 18, 1988, in the midst of insane provisions, is Article 7, quote, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, 'O Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him.'" End of quote. It should not be ignored. There were people carrying signs here in Washington on Saturday and Sunday about trees and rocks. This is what it is, killing Jews. With that in mind, it's also, again, bipartisan. Congressman Keating, I appreciate what he stated, and that is that we've had U.S. forces come under fire in Iraq and Syria more than 40 times from the Iranian puppet forces. Dozens of Americans have been reported injured in these attacks. Sadly, to me, it's been concealed from the American people how serious this is. The U.S. has responded militarily just one time, attacking apparently an empty warehouse. With the technology we have today, Secretary Stroul, we should be able to identify the location of the launching sites, and they should be responded to immediately and not discussed or whatever. We've got the technology. We need. Why are we not acting to protect the American people?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. President Biden has been clear that he has directed self-defense strikes in protection of our forces and will do so again. There is no higher priority. It is quite clear that Iran and its proxy groups are escalating against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, and we have a range of options at our disposal to defend ourselves.
And indeed, I have a staff person in the region. I'm so concerned, and all of us have family members. My 4 sons have served in Iraq, Egypt, and Afghanistan. The thought of it's good that we're providing air defense capability, but we should be going after the launch sites. They can be identified. That's just with the technology we have today. To me, it's inexcusable. Why are we not going after identifying and going after the launch sites?
Congressman, I can't speak to every specific operational decision. I'd be happy to brief you more in a closed session, but I will also say that Iran and its proxy groups disguise many of its warehouses, depots, and launch sites in areas that have civilians around, and so the U.S. military takes precautions and assess how we're going to respond based on proportionality, necessity, and distinction.
And hey, for years, anytime there would be an attack by Hezbollah, Hamas, or Houthis, the American media covers the Iranian response, Israeli response, not the attack. And so let's get ready for that, because we are going to be accused of being the perpetrators when, in fact, there should be self-defense. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that all of us, or almost all of us, were shocked and enraged by the attack on October 7th. I certainly expressed that. I have been concerned since then about how the Netanyahu administration has carried out its response. I don't have faith or confidence that Prime Minister Netanyahu can protect Israelis, will follow the humanitarian rules of war, or prevent a larger regional conflict that will rope in the United States. Do you know how many missiles have hit Gaza now? An area that's 141 square miles. I asked that of either witness.
Congressman, I don't have the specific number of airstrikes at my disposal.
The latest estimate that I saw was about 20,000. And as far as I can tell, there have only been about 5 hostages that have been released. It seems to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu is prioritizing collective punishment over the release of hostages. And I'm very concerned about that. Please.
Thank you for that question. I'm not going to characterize the prioritization of the Israel Defense Forces. What their operations in Gaza are intended to dismantle the military infrastructure of Hamas that made it possible to perpetrate an attack like the world saw on October 7th.
And I want to be clear, I think they should be able to protect themselves against a similar attack. We have long supported them in their ability to do that. But they also directly struck an ambulance. They struck refugee shelters 2 or 3 times. How do we explain that? As we take votes for support, as we try to assess the situation, I think just as the world is aghast at the barbarity of what happened October 7th, the world also looks at that and asks the question about why an ambulance, why 30-something members of the press have been killed, why 4,000 or 5,000 children have already been killed.
They're extremely serious questions, and we should hold Israel and the Israel Defense Forces to the same standards that the U.S. holds any ally or partner, and that is adherence to the law around conflict and necessity, distinction, and proportionality in its execution and implementation of its military operations. With respect to the ambulance convoy, this is a good example of the misinformation and disinformation environment. The Israel Defense Forces announced that they saw Hamas terrorists using the ambulance to conceal militants and weapons. It is also incumbent on the Israel Defense Forces and the Israeli government to make that information known so the world can understand how Hamas disguises itself and its tactics in civilian structures.
I had read very disturbing reporting a few days ago that has been fairly consistent that there has continued to be a lack of substantial or necessary food and water that has reached Gaza, that the water system, for example, is out. Can you please tell us what the latest humanitarian situation is there?
Yes, Congressman, the water system has been a focus of our efforts. The water was initially shut off. We got the Israelis to turn it back on. Some of the pipes, there are several major pipes. They've sustained damage at different times. The Israelis have worked to repair the damage where they could. The operating environment for getting humanitarian assistance in is unbelievably complex. And as I said, it's this combination of the Egyptians having very legitimate concerns about influx of fighters disguised as...
I guess, because I'm running out of time,
sorry.
I want to ask one more question,
please.
perhaps for the record. But I would ask that the State Department, that the Biden administration do everything it can to make sure that humanitarian assistance, regardless of who's holding it up, makes its way to the people there. My final question, I'll try to read it in time. On Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said that he intends for Israel to have, quote, overall security responsibility over Gaza for, quote, an indefinite period. Israel's heritage minister, who proposed using nuclear weapons on Gaza and was not forced to resign for that statement because Benjamin Netanyahu, for his coalition, is partly beholden to the far right, has proposed establishing settlements in Gaza. This week, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said that the president does not believe that a reoccupation by Israeli forces is the right thing to do. For the record, what alternatives to an Israeli reoccupation have you raised with the Netanyahu administration? And does the Biden administration oppose establishment of settlements which are illegal under international law in Gaza?
Yes, we absolutely oppose them, and we also oppose a reoccupation of Gaza by Israel
Thank
or
you.
any other country.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you all for being here. I'm greatly concerned about the safety of Israel and for the safety of Jewish Americans. The responses we've seen around the country to the October 7th attacks, especially at some of our colleges and universities, to me is a problem, especially our public institutions. I'm a great supporter of the exercise of the First Amendment, and I believe it is critical for the American way of life. But people must be allowed to speak freely and assemble peacefully. But when that speech is in favor of terrorists, we must look at the underlying issues. Why did students rally in support for Hamas, a group that viciously attacked innocent people, beheaded and burned children, and raped young girls? This is because our younger generations are not taught everything that the greatest generation learned through war. Evil is evil, and it must be stopped. The fact that these rallies for Hamas were even allowed is beyond troubling. Allowing these protests isn't educational progress. This is progressivism at its worst. Students and others that rallied in support of the actions on October 7th have proven their lack of historical knowledge. 80 years ago, this country went to war with the Axis powers that sought to destroy any way of life that they felt was inferior to their own. My family knows these people well. I lost an uncle to the Nazis, and my daddy fought the Japanese in the Pacific. And then he went on to China and fought the communists there for a short while. This is the type of enemy we promised the world we would never allow again. I support the efforts of Israel to rid the world of a group that is hell-bent on murdering Jews. Our attention to this tragedy must be twofold. We must support Israel in this fight, and we must educate our young people that evil is evil and must be dealt with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. As you have heard all of us say, but I'll say it for the record myself, on October 7th, we all watched in horror as Hamas terrorists murdered, tortured, raped, and kidnapped over 1,400 Israelis. 32 Americans were also killed in that attack. This grotesque assault on our closest ally in the region deserves universal condemnation from every member in this body. The U.S., the UN, and much of the international community have designated Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization. Their stated goal is the destruction and decimation of all Israeli people. Their actions have also demonstrated their indifference towards the safety of Palestinian people. There is absolutely no room for sympathy or equivocation when it comes to Hamas, and about that we should be absolutely clear. I join my colleagues in applauding President Biden for his stalwart support of Israel during this time, and I commend Secretary Blinken for his masterclass in shuttle diplomacy to shore up the U.S. bilateral relationships with our regional partners and to lay the groundwork for intensive diplomatic efforts to achieve sustainable peace. Words do matter, and what we talk about in this committee and in Congress also matters. That's why urging for an adherence to international law and the laws of war while ramping up humanitarian aid is so important. This assertion is not anti-Israeli. Prime Minister Netanyahu himself has agreed to this in principle. I echo President Biden's calls for temporary localized pauses to allow for surges of humanitarian aid, but I remain opposed to a long-term durable ceasefire until all hostages are returned and certain commitments are made by Hamas. A premature ceasefire would give Hamas a reprieve and allow them to regroup, reorganize, and rearm. I also urge at the same time, though, the IDF to reconsider its tactics to ensure its counterterrorism campaign is proportionate. Again, these remarks should not be misconstrued as delegitimizing Israel's campaign to root out Hamas. We cannot accept the false choice that Republicans have been pushing on us when they say you either support Israel in its war effort or you support Hamas. Bolstering Israel's defense and urging the protection of innocent Palestinians are not mutually exclusive ideas. We can and we must do both. I'd like to ask my question, though, more specifically about Turkey. Ms. Stroul, Turkey consistently tops the list of U.S. arms importers and recipients of U.S. military aid because it's considered a strategic NATO ally. I believe Turkey's relationship with Hamas alone is enough to cease all arms exports to Ankara as Erdogan continues to express his sympathy for Hamas, not to mention the fact that Turkey has routinely acted as a spoiler within the NATO alliance. The Arms Export Control Act requires the U.S. government to conduct in-use monitoring of where these military exports go. I wonder if there have been any indications that Turkey's relationship with Hamas has resulted in the transfer of weapons of U.S. origin to Hamas by Turkey, and how is the U.S. government able to ascertain and deal with that?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. As part of any foreign military sale to any partner or ally, there is robust end-use monitoring for how those weapons are used. We have no indication that anything provided to Turkey has fallen into the hands of Hamas.
Well, that's reassuring. I would just ask you, too, how you are balancing the relationship with Qatar and Turkey in terms of their assistance with hopefully getting out some of the hostages and their having Hamas leadership within their boundaries, visiting.
Congresswoman, what I would say is the following. Qatar and Egypt, but especially Qatar, have been profoundly involved in the relentless quest to secure the release of hostages, foreign hostages, Israeli hostages, the whole lot. They've also been engaged in a very intensive effort to help with the help Ambassador Satterfield in his efforts to get humanitarian assistance in and foreign nationals out, something that has been impeded repeatedly by Hamas. Of course, the military leadership is well protected underground, far from the conflict above. The political leadership is the external piece through which the Qataris are working, and the Egyptians as well.
Nobody's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Barr.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to my colleague on the other side of the aisle who is expressing this idea of proportionality with respect to Gaza, I think it's important that in this moment, in the face of this barbarism from Hamas terrorists, that we're careful not to use nuance too much. What we need right now is moral clarity, and nuance is not really apropos at the moment. As you said in response to my colleague, there is a lot of misinformation. Why an ambulance? Because it was full of Hamas terrorists and weapons. That's why an ambulance. Moral clarity requires that we call out terrorism for what it is. And when there are calls for a ceasefire that would only enable Hamas to reconstitute another attack, that's not appropriate either. So, Ms. Leaf, I do want to address Secretary Blinken's call for Israel to provide a humanitarian pause. We all support humanitarian assistance for the innocent, but those running Gaza do not care about humanitarian needs, as you know and as you've testified. Did Hamas prevent innocent Palestinians from fleeing Gaza City to safer locations further south in Gaza?
Absolutely.
And does this make it harder for those people to access aid?
Absolutely.
And Ms. Leaf, is Hamas actively hoarding resources to pursue its Islamic jihadist war against Israel instead of providing water, fuel, and food to those affected by war?
Yes, they are.
And Ms. Leaf, do you feel Hamas would use any pause in Israel's effort to root out terrorist cells and uncover Hamas's urban terrorist network to resupply its warfighters?
They would certainly attempt to, but that is something that I know that the Israeli government is actively considering.
So I hope that the Secretary and the President consider that when calling for a humanitarian pause. Did President Biden condition any support for Israel on the IDF engaging in a pause?
No, he did not.
Well, that's good to hear. Let me follow up on the line of questioning regarding our partner in Qatar. Of course, the Qataris have been very helpful with Al Udeid Air Base, and we appreciate that. But with respect to releasing hostages, how helpful have they been? Are they using their considerable leverage to seek the release of all hostages immediately?
They absolutely are. They've worked at it relentlessly. The problem is who they're talking to at the other end of the phone line. And it's a real question as to whether Yahya Sinwar is serious in any degree about releasing those hostages.
And is the Hamas office in Qatar seeing any pressure from the Qatari government?
Absolutely.
It's good to hear. I do think the Qataris are important partners for us, but we want to make sure that we emphasize to them how helpful they can be in this moment. They want to be kind of the Switzerland of the Middle East. They can be very, very helpful in this moment, and I appreciate us taking advantage of that relationship. Taylor Force Act, real quick, Ms. Leaf, with the war ongoing, how are we ensuring that any U.S. support to NGOs operating in Gaza are not violating the Taylor Force Act? Are we seeing any support for the families of Hamas terrorists killed during the invasion of Israel in exchange for their participation?
We are not seeing any of that, and we have asked the question and received the right assurances.
Is the administration reconsidering this idea of providing assistance to NGOs, supposedly pro-Palestinian NGOs, as a way of bypassing or circumventing the Taylor Force Act?
We do not bypass or circumvent the letter or the spirit of the Taylor Force Act.
I just think there ought to be some analysis of aid that may not go to the Palestinian Authority, but nevertheless goes to NGOs that could serve as a kind of proxy for martyr payments. And so I just want rigorous oversight from the State Department so that both the spirit and the letter of Taylor Force is complied with.
I can assure you of that, Congressman.
Finally, this issue of sanctions relief and the Financial Services Committee, we had a very important testimony about the $16 billion that was unfrozen, both in terms of the South Korea deal with the hostage deal and also the $10 billion held in Iraq to pay off Baghdad's debts for its purchase of Iranian natural gas. It's a lot of money that has been basically effectively sanctions relief delivered to Iran as a result of this administration's policies. Is the Biden administration reconsidering chasing sanctions relief with Iran in light of the events of October 7th?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the verb you use. Is the Biden administration changing?
Chasing sanctions relief with Iran. Has the administration reconsidered that course, that policy, given October 7th and the events that have occurred?
So the monies you referred to from South Korea that have been moved to different accounts that will be put through a rigorous metered process that will only be spent on humanitarian goods, food, and medicine and so forth, that is not altered. That was an arrangement set up by the previous administration, and we are rigorously applying the same restrictions to it. The money has not moved. The monies you referred to for natural.
I'm sorry. I'm just, in fairness to the witnesses and to the other members, I want to keep this on time.
My time has expired, but I think the line of questioning illustrates the point that maximum pressure was working and moving away was the wrong move. Thanks.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For both witnesses, are there any updates that either of you can provide in this unclassified setting regarding the status of the hostages?
I could not. I'd be happy to talk to you in a different setting.
Thank you. Same for you. Okay. Let me ask you this. Is the administration in continuous contact with the Israeli government about the status of the hostages, and can we be assured that the administration will provide whatever assistance may be helpful in that effort?
24/7, I can assure you. And yes, we are providing all support.
Thank you. Moving on, ever since these horrible attacks, which don't need to be further described because we all know exactly what we're talking about, happened on October 7th. I personally have felt devastated. So many Americans have, as well as people around the world. I felt that both as an American and a member of Congress, but also as a Jewish American. But that heartbreak has been amplified by horrific cases of both Palestinians and Jewish Americans being targeted here in the United States, including the unthinkable murder of Wadi al-Fayoum, the 6-year-old Palestinian-American boy in Chicago, as well as the death of a 69-year-old Jewish man, Paul Kessler, after he was injured during an altercation at a rally or competing rallies while he was peacefully waving an Israeli flag. And that obviously is of deep concern to all of us for the safety of Americans generally, for the safety of people with Palestinian or any kind of Arabic background, as well as people who are Jews. And my concern is that in this climate, rhetoric that equates everyday Palestinians, civilians, let's just call them civilians, to Hamas, including at times in this body, Congress, is not just morally unacceptable, but it's also tantamount to actively endangering the lives of our fellow Americans. And I will say that as a representative of a district that includes a vibrant Jewish community, as well as a vibrant Palestinian American community and other Arab American and Muslim communities, these issues are really personal to me and many of my constituents. So first let me ask whether both of you agree with the premise that Hamas is a terrorist organization.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And would you agree that the rhetoric that equates Palestinian civilians or Palestinian Americans with Hamas is rhetoric that actually strengthens Hamas and undermines Israel's security by feeding into their propaganda that Hamas is a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people?
We absolutely make a distinction. Hamas as a terrorist organization has perpetrated a brutal set of attacks. The Palestinian people don't deserve to be lumped in such a way, and so we absolutely distinguish in our discussion of that topic.
And did you want to add anything to that?
It is, I completely agree with Assistant Secretary Leaf. The Palestinians in Gaza deserve much better than Hamas, and it is critical from a Department of Defense perspective that military operations distinguish between targeting Hamas and protecting innocent Palestinian civilians.
Thank you. I want to turn to something else just because of the shortage of time. I'm very, very concerned about the humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians in Gaza. And we know that the only place where this is available is through the Rafah crossing, which seems to have alternating access and the availability of passing through. As of a couple of hours ago, according to an article that I just saw during this hearing, the crossing's been shut down due to some sort of security incident. Can you speak about ongoing efforts to increase the amount of aid and how to get it to the innocent civilians?
Ambassador Satterfield and his team, backstopped by here in Washington, but backstopped by our missions in Cairo and Jerusalem, is working relentlessly. The operating environment is so phenomenally complex, and the security conditions on the other side in Gaza are parlous, that it has been just an exhausting effort to keep that aperture open. But that is what we are focused on, and we are determined to steadily increase the number of trucks over this next period. It's now about anywhere from 70 to 100. We want to get it up to 300, 400, 500.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for you, Secretary Leaf. Professor Alan Dershowitz recently talked about a Hamas strategy that he referred to as the CNN strategy, or what others have labeled the dead baby strategy. The basic concept is that Hamas attacks Israel in a manner that it knows will draw a military response. Then in a strategy that can only be described as barbaric and cowardly, Hamas retreats into its strongholds, as we've been discussing, and uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. Not that Hamas has any regard for the law of war, or are there any other rules for that matter, but engaging in disgusting acts such as this is a complete and utter violation of the law of armed conflict. Israel does its best, I think, to avoid civilian casualties, and in this conflict gave civilians time to depart from northern Gaza, an act which Hamas reportedly attempted to block. And I heard earlier today that there was also things that just millions of flyers were dropped all over northern Gaza. They made thousands and thousands of phone calls to evacuate people before anything happened. So I think they're doing their best to avoid this. But eventually there are civilian casualties with this setup. Hamas then blames Israel as the guilty party, claiming that they are willingly killing innocent civilians. The success of this CNN strategy depends on the mainstream media, and unfortunately, perhaps members of Congress, as we recently heard here with the ambulance comment, which anyone who knew of the ambulance story certainly knew that it was filled with Hamas fighters, because every story I saw on every channel, they were grouped together. So anyways, but it relies on them buying into this narrative and allowing itself to be used as a tool of Hamas. So Secretary Leaf, I was just wondering, what efforts, if any, is the administration undertaking to ensure that Hamas in their CNN strategy is ineffective? Specifically, what is the administration doing to push back on Hamas' false narrative and to show American people in the world that Israel has an inherent right to self-defense, that Israel's current operation is on solid legal footing, and that Hamas is the one that is violating the law of war in numerous ways? What are we doing to stop this spread of this misinformation?
Thank you, Congressman. You know, the point of Hamas's operations is terror. Full stop, and they are masters at propaganda, as you note. The good news is that most governments around the region well recognize what kind of entity that that we're dealing with. The publics are inflamed. There's no question. The publics are inflamed by by images of mounting casualties, and that's an issue across the region. We are in a constant tempo of direct engagement discussions, public affairs efforts to really set the record straight. But it is quite a challenging environment for just the reasons you cite.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Probably doing your best you can, but I think it's going to be more important as time goes on to up that game a little bit, because as this war goes on, that narrative is just going to grow and grow. Ms. Stroul, my next question is for you. The Biden administration recently presented testimony before this committee explicitly asking that Congress not include Iranian-backed proxies in a new authorized use of military force that we're considering. Since, as you noted in your opening statement, Iran-backed proxies in Iraq and Syria have launched at least 41 attacks on U.S. service members, while Hamas and Hezbollah continue to attack our friend and our ally Israel on a daily basis. Given the increased threat posed by Iranian-backed groups and proxies, has this administration's position on whether to include Iran-backed groups and proxies in a new AUMF changed?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. The position of this administration has not changed. Our self-defense strikes against Iran-backed militia groups have the underpinning of the President's Article 2 authority under the Constitution.
Okay. I guess that's a question for a later day. I would think that if we're going to include other groups, that maybe this would be one of the ones that we'd want to include as well, despite what you stated there, since they seem to be one of our biggest threats right now. But Secretary Stroul, this is my last question, given the chaos on the ground, the entrenchment of Hamas among the Palestinian people, and Hamas's history of misappropriating aid intended for civilian populations, what realistic and meaningful guardrails are being employed by the Biden administration to prevent Hamas from obtaining the food, the water, the medicine, and the other humanitarian aid that is intended for civilians?
I'd be happy to take that one, Congressman. So to date, we have not seen evidence that they have diverted that aid. It is something that is something that we are monitoring. There's obviously, it's quite a difficult security environment on the other side in Gaza, where aid goes in and where aid workers are working. But we are doing our best.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Allred.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here. I want to begin by just reaffirming my support for Israel and condemning in the strongest terms possible Hamas for this unprecedented and barbaric attack on October 7th. I, too, visited a kibbutz in February that was later called by an Israeli general the site of a massacre, and it stays with me. I also want to make clear this is a war with Hamas and not all Palestinians or Muslims generally. Hamas started this war, and they have to be held accountable, but we must also do everything we can to limit innocent civilian casualties and provide crucially needed humanitarian aid where we can. And I'd like to connect some of the dots and paint a broader picture for folks who might be watching about the global battle that I see it emerging against autocracy and terrorism that's emerging, and that we'll need to rise above our own partisan politics here to effectively combat. The President has requested slightly over $92 billion to help us respond to the war between Israel and Hamas, to support Ukraine, and to support Taiwan. Ambassador Leaf, in this setting, what can you share about the growing connection between Hamas and Russia, as well as Russia's increased hostility to Israel?
So some of that would probably be better in a different setting, Congressman, but I think we're seeing clear evidence of that growing defense relationship, and it's pretty appalling when you think about it. Russia has already clearly developed an arms relationship with Iran, but now they're doing so with a terrorist organization. So they're really on the wrong side in every possible sense. But I'd be happy to get back to you in a classified setting.
And I've been in those settings. And can you briefly just maybe ballpark the percentage of support that Hamas gets from Iran in terms of their overall budget?
I don't have those figures offhand. I think it's grown over time, but you'd also have to count in just lethal aid and training. There's a whole complex of support.
But the connection is pretty well established.
Yes, it
obviously. Deputy Assistant Secretary Stroul, can you just tell us about what Iran is providing to Russia in their war against Ukraine?
Our Defense Intelligence Agency has actually declassified significant amounts of imagery demonstrating that one-way attack unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, that Russia is using to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine is actually of Iranian origin. So Iran is providing weapons, training, and technical know-how to Russia for its war of choice in Ukraine.
Yeah. And can either of you or both of you discuss briefly how Russia and China are helping prop up the Iranian economy?
I would have to get back to you
okay.
with some figures on that. I've drawn a blank on that.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Well, as I see it, what we're dealing with here is the need to respond to an international axis of rogue states, terrorists, and dictators, And this can be seen, of course, as we've discussed, through Iran's support for Hamas and its proxies, along with the Kremlin's warming relations with terrorist organizations like Hamas, Russia's reliance on Iran, as you mentioned, in their war in Ukraine, and Iran's reliance on Russia and China. Even North Korea is providing munitions to Russia, and that's why we need to pass this supplemental bill, and that's what brings together these overarching conflicts. Deputy Secretary Stroul, you noted earlier in your testimony the presence of our carrier fleets and the recent arrival of an Ohio-class nuclear sub in the Mediterranean. My understanding is that 9 senior military positions in the command responsible for the Middle East are caught up in the current blockade by a senator of military positions. What impact has that had on our ability to respond to this conflict?
What it has done is erode the morale of our military leadership who have been nominated for other positions. We have, for example, our senior defense official in Israel is nominated to be promoted to a 1-star representative and has not. So when at a precise moment in time where we would want our best and most senior leadership on the ground working with the Israeli Defense Forces every day, his nomination and promotion is held up by the holds in the Senate.
Yeah. Well, I would just note that we are, I think, 9 days away from a potential government shutdown. Our new speaker has chosen to put forward a partisan bill that for the first time conditioned aid to Israel. When this attack occurred on Israel, we did not have an ambassador in place to Israel, Egypt, Kuwait, Lebanon, or Oman. Our partisan politics are getting in the way of our ability to respond to this crisis and support our allies. And I put forward that we should put that aside to help us deal with this crisis. Thank you for your presence today.
Thank you very much, Congressman Cullen Allred. And we now proceed to Congresswoman Young Kim of California.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm glad that we have you here to speak to us as we continue to show our support for Israel. But I am concerned that there is an increased attack on U.S. troops by the Iran's proxies in Iraq and Syria. And last week, the number of reported injuries service members doubled. I want to ask you, was it because there were additional attacks or because initial number of injuries were underreported?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for that question. What it indicates is that some of the injuries became more apparent over time. So there was initial monitoring, many of the forces returned to duty, and then reported symptoms after, and that is why you saw an increase in the number.
Okay. What is your assessment of Houthis' involvement in the war against Israel? And what is driving their attacks?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. It's a good one. Look, they are, as a movement, very ideologically committed to a sort of death to America, death to the Jews, death to Israel sort of outlook on the world, shall we say. They have thus tried to enter into the fray, largely unsuccessfully, thanks to the good efforts of our U.S. military.
Can you talk about how that impacts our U.S. national security interest in Red Sea, like freedom of navigation?
It's a direct threat.
Do you have any thoughts?
I agree it's a direct threat, and I would note it's specifically why one of the core U.S. interests in the region is freedom of navigation, and we have been very clear in the last several days about sending the USS Carrier Strike Group Eisenhower through the Suez and through the Red Sea, as well as the USS Florida, the nuclear-guided submarine.
Thank you. You know, the Gaza Strip is a notoriously difficult military operating environment, given the defense urban terrain and expansive tunnel network. Still, the IDF has significant combat advantages over Hamas, and they've made substantive progress in the first days of what will likely be a lengthy ground operation. I want to ask you if the administration is prepared to support Israel throughout the duration of its campaign to defeat Hamas.
From President Biden to Secretary Blinken to Secretary Austin and on down the chain, the commitment to Israel's security and having it ensuring that it has what it needs to defend itself from terrorism is ironclad.
Okay. You know, there is a bipartisan consensus in Congress that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps be designated as a terrorist organization by the EU. How is the administration proactively working with our EU allies to accomplish that bipartisan goal?
It is a topic of discussion, and we certainly support that.
Great, thank you. And I would like to yield the remaining time to my colleague, Mr. Mills.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to follow up. You know, we had a colleague of ours just recently on the other side that was talking about how these ambulances are being struck or these buildings are being struck. And I just wanted to put that in perspective. Of the entire Gaza area, there's about 260,000 structures. Is that correct?
You've got me. I know the sort of the general dimensions of the Gaza Strip and the population and so forth. I don't know the exact count on
Well, my understanding is that of the 260,000 structures, about 9,500 have had any structural damage or have been actually targeted as a result of IDF utilizing it to go after weapon caches or to focus on terror tunnels or to look at areas where key Hamas leadership is. And I just want to paint that perspective because that's only about 3% of the entire area, and when you see mainstream media, they try to paint it as if it is an entire demolition of all of Gaza, and it's just a false narrative. The last thing I want to ask is are you aware of a gentleman named Salih al-Jafarawi?
No, I am not.
He is a Bollywood actor. Are you aware of Bollywood? So Bollywood is essentially where certain crisis actors, he's a very interesting gentleman because at 25 years old, he's apparently a radiologist, a singer, a Hamas fighter, a doctor, and he's actually been killed and was resurrected. So quite an interesting individual. The reason I mention this is because he's about as real as the ghost of Kiev. He has legitimately gone forward and utilizing this misinformation and propaganda warfare is continuing to try and look as if the U.S., the Department of Defense, and the IDF is in some way just indiscriminately killing civilians, which we know is to be false. And so just out of the last second I have or so, would you agree that some of the misinformation and propaganda that is being spun up at this time is, in fact, been proven inaccurate, just like the ambulances and others who are portraying things that are untrue to try and gain unfavorable outcomes for our joint forces?
Yes, a good example is the accusation that the IDF is responsible for the Al-Ahli hospital strike.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate my colleague lending her time. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Kim and Congressman Mills.
All right,
And just grateful. And we now proceed to Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. You know, I know we've had many conversations in classified settings where we've talked about the military operations on the ground. As someone who's Jewish with family living in Israel, this is deeply personal to me, and my heart breaks for every Palestinian child who is being killed in this conflict through no fault of their own. I know one of the things that President Biden has emphasized was the lessons that we learned in our own experience after September 11th. You know, I was in middle school, and we're still dealing with the consequences that we, both this body and the United States in general, made after that attack. And, you know, one of the things that I think was a key lesson learned was that minimizing civilian harm is incredibly important in the fight against violent extremism. So I was wondering if you could share what some of the specific lessons learned in our own fight against terrorism that are useful in this situation now and that we've conveyed to the Israeli government.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for those questions. Secretary Austin speaks about lessons learned from the past 2 decades of the United States military experience. A key lesson is that there is a continuous and consistent need to attend to the needs of the civilian population in order for military gains to be sustainable.
I would just add that, you know, that the first trip that Secretary Blinken and I and the rest of his team made to Israel fell 4 or 5 days after the massacre. And I can only say that both the leadership, the country more broadly, but the leadership was in a state of shock and deep trauma, and that trauma is still there. I think part of what we have seen our job to be, both on the civilian side and the military side, is to be a strong shoulder to lean on and help nation in trauma and shock and its leadership move through that as they made decisions about the military campaign and so forth. So there's been a good, robust soldier-to-soldier discussion about this, and of course, our own leadership is engaged in that. But the president spoke from his heart when he said that, and he spoke as a friend that learned from us, because we did make some very grave decisions, grave mistakes rather, early on and through that continuous fight against, the terrorist scourge that come to our shores.
Well, thank you. And I know the Israelis themselves have openly said that many of the provisions we've seen around food and water and humanitarian assistance have been directly because of the advocacy of the U.S. government. So I thank you for all of your tireless work on that. And I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that he is not willing to do a humanitarian pause, and I appreciate all of the work you all have been doing to continue encouraging him to make sure that we are able to get that assistance. I want to move to our U.S. forces in the region. Obviously, we've repositioned significant military resources to deter this from expanding, and especially from Hezbollah and Iran from further intervening. Can you commit to us that you will come to Congress before conducting combat operations or other hostilities against a belligerent in this unfolding conflict, especially any hostilities that could escalate?
If Congresswoman, you are referencing anything other than the self-defense strikes that President Biden has ordered under his Article 2 authority, yes, we would consult with Congress.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And lastly, I want to ask, there's been public reporting about the U.S. approving the sale of military-style weapons for the Israeli National Police. The Israeli National Police obviously are under the purview of Minister Ben-Gvir, one of the far-right extremists. We've also seen concerns that some of those weapons, in addition to being used by the National Police themselves in ways that are probably not necessarily aligned with what we would want policing to be, also have been given directly to settlers who are engaging in settler violence. What assurances can you give us about whether or not those weapons are actually being approved, and whether or not they will be used for things that I think we all would agree we don't approve of?
Thank you. Congressman, thank you for that. In all of these cases, we have been provided assurances, and we have rigorous oversight or end-use monitoring for all of this. There were weapons that will be provided to what are called Community Immediate Response Teams, CIRT, that report directly to regional police or border patrol commanders. They will, and they supervise the use of those, and and to the personnel who are volunteers for these organizations, and it is only within Green Line Israel. But we have an elaborate set of assurances on that.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to, if I may, just quickly follow up on a point that Ms. Jacobs made on the use of military force. You know, this committee is charged with that responsibility, and we take that very seriously. I understand you're using Article 2 self-defense when it comes to our troops being under fire and attack, and I get that. If the administration were to respond either preemptively to the IRGC or to Hezbollah or to Hamas, do you believe that you would have to come before this committee for that authorization?
If we were responding to an attack in self-defense, then we would rely on the president's Article 2 authority. If we were taking action that would elevate to war in the constitutional sense, we would consult with Congress and seek authorization for the use of military force.
If, say, hypothetically, Hezbollah launched 100,000 rockets into Israel and we wanted to respond, I would argue you do not have authorization to hit Hamas.
I would agree with you, Jim.
And same with, not Hamas, I mean Hezbollah. And probably the same with Hamas in that situation.
If the United States, if President Biden wanted to to work with Israel to respond should Hezbollah decide to launch that amount of rockets into Israel, we would certainly come consult with Congress.
Thank you. And I think we're all in agreement on that. So thank you very much.